Should we start?
Sonal, wait till 6:05.
Okay.
People are joining, so just wait for another 2 minutes.
Yes, still trickling in. So Dr. Abhishek, had some fever or something. I was just told cold or fever or something. All well?
Yeah, I'm not well, sir.
Oh, right, okay. You're in Mumbai only, no?
Yeah, I'm in Mumbai only. I'm not well, sir.
Okay. So, Dr. Manasuda, you are first generation,
Dr.
second
Sunil
generation.
Narayan, we are live, so kindly keep.
We are live? Okay. I thought 6:05. So
Dr. Sunil Narayan, we are live, so kindly keep.
Yes, Dr. Narayan.
I thought 6:05. So
Dr. Sunil Narayan, so kindly keep.
Yes,
I thought 6:05. So
Dr. Sunil Narayan, so kindly keep.
no, this is.
So Sonal, you may start now, please.
Good evening, all. Today we have a great scholarly lecture webinar by Dr. Anmansha Datta, and Indian Academy of Neurology Neurorehab subsection is privileged to have great scholarly panel enlightening on aphasia awareness. In view of that, we have a scholarly theme of thinking beyond language assessment and executive functions and patient outcome assessment to be enlightened by Dr. Mansha Datta. I welcome all the faculty on the board. I welcome all the attendees here. I welcome Professor Dr. Surya sir, who is President IAN. I also thank IAN President and IAN Secretary for giving us opportunity to have this aphasia awareness program in collaboration with Indian Speech and Hearing Association, Indian Federation of Neuro Rehabilitation, Aphasia Stroke Association of India. May I have slide of moderator, Abhishek sir? Dr. Abhishek Srivastava slide, please. Yeah. Dr. Abhishek sir, thanks for being on the panel today. Dr. Abhishek sir, Abhishek Srivastava is a head neuro rehabilitation specialist, director of Center for Rehabilitation Kokilabhen Hospital, and he has great accolades to his name from the pioneering work in neurological rehabilitation in country on multiple sclerosis, stroke, head injury. He has written several papers, and he chairs the SIG multiple sclerosis of WFNR. He is also secretary Indian Federation of Rehabilitation. Welcome, sir. May I have you introduce our chair? Dr. Professor S.K. Narayanan, we welcome you, sir, to have you on the board. Professor Sunil Narayanan is Professor, Department of Neurology in JIPMER. He's a founder of programs of DM Neurology, MSc Neurotechnology, PDF Stroke, and PhD in Neurology courses. He has many innovation to his credit in terms of neurobiology labs at JIPMER. His areas of interest are stroke, NDG, autism, spectral, EEG, neurobiology, neurorehabilitation, and modulation. Welcome, sir. May I have slide of our co-chair, Dr. Annama George, ma'am? Dr. Sunil Narayanan, could I request you to introduce Dr. Annama George, please?
Hi. So today in our panel, we have joined by Ms. Annama George, who is a speech and language pathologist at the Sri Chitra Tirunal Institute of Medical Science and Technology at Trivandrum. She is right now also continuing her service and expert service at several private institutions in the city with a lot of experience and a lot of patients in some of the best of hospitals in Trivandrum. She has long years of experience of around 25 years and was a postgraduate gold medalist from the University of Mysore at the speech and hearing program. She has won several awards, including the Best Poster Award at the 5th Asia-Oceanic Epilepsy Congress in 2004, Best Poster Award at the 7th and 8th Joint Annual Congress of the Indian Epilepsy Association. She has done the Professor R.K. Oza Oration Award in 2020. There are a number of publications and invited talks where she has contributed, and her areas of interest are aphasia rehabilitation, multilingualism, dementia, epilepsy, and functional MRI, especially in the area of speech and language. Welcome, Dr. Annama.
Thank you, sir.
Could you please introduce our speaker?
Yeah. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Manaswita Datta, who's going to be our speaker for the day. She is currently an assistant professor at the Rush University, and she has been involved in several professional development and certifications, and that is the ISHA Mentoring Academic Research Careers Mentee, and she's got a certification in motivational interviewing. Her professional service includes as a working group co-creator in 2019, and that is continuing to present. And she's also part of the working group named Focusing on Quality of Spoken Discourse in Aphasia. She has several research interests, which includes cognitive linguistic abilities associated with aging and neurogenic communication disorders, including aphasia, dementia, and TBI. And she's also interested and researching the use of neuroimaging and electrophysiological procedures in examining neural mechanisms and underlying cognition and language processing, both in neurotypical adults and individuals with neurological disorders. Manaswita, we're glad to have you here, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Dr. George. Would you like to share my screen and get started?
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to make sure you're able to see my full
Yes,
screen.
ma'am, we can see your slides.
Thank you so much. I just want to make sure. Okay. All right. Okay. Excellent. All right, if everything is okay, I'm going to get started. Well, thank you again, Dr. George, for the very kind introduction and for the opportunity to present on my research work today. It's truly an honor and pleasure to be here and to present, especially during Aphasia Awareness Month. And so before I get started, I just wanted to, Dr. George already introduced me, but I just wanted to give you a little bit more background about myself. I'm an assistant professor at Rush University Medical Center, but I'm also teaching courses in aphasia, cognitive communication disorders, and neuroscience. So I'm very heavily involved with student mentoring and teaching. I definitely am an active researcher, and also I see patients in the clinic and supervise students in the clinic as well. And so as previously stated, broadly speaking, my interests are looking at how cognitive linguistic skills change as a result of aging and neurological brain damage. More specifically, I have two areas of research, areas and lines of research. One is looking at the assessment and treatment of these underlying cognitive skills that can have an impact on communication outcomes and life participation outcomes in people with aphasia. And my second line of research is spoken discourse analysis, or the analysis of naturalistic language use. And I've looked at this through the lens of different neurological disorders, so aphasia, bilingual dementia, as well as other neurological disorders like epilepsy. So let me go back to this slide and introduce the topic. Today, I'm going to be talking about thinking beyond language assessment in aphasia. Mainly, I'm going to be focusing on the importance of executive functioning and also patient-reported outcomes. So the learning objectives for today's talk, at the end of the talk, we will be able to identify skills beyond language-specific processes that may contribute to communication. I will be describing long-term consequences of these concomitant executive functioning impairments that we commonly see in people with aphasia. I will also be discussing and we'll determine some assessment tools that would be appropriate for assessing executive functioning and cognition in general and functional outcomes in people with aphasia. And finally, I will be discussing the importance of looking at the patient as a whole, doing a more holistic assessment that really goes beyond just looking at specific discrete language processes. As everybody who's on this call knows that aphasia is a communication disorder, it is one of the most devastating consequences of acquired brain injury. It affects our ability to speak, understand, read, write, and also in kind of communicating in everyday social situations. So we're all here for the same reason, to help people with aphasia. We have seen people with aphasia in different capacities, but we all know that people with aphasia are at a much greater risk of long-term disability, increased social isolation, and poor psychosocial well-being. So As a whole, this disorder can have a very detrimental impact on one's quality of life. So let me begin by two case examples. We have patient A, who is a 70-year-old male. He lives with his daughter, and he has been diagnosed with moderate to severe Broca's aphasia in the chronic stages. As we understand, he has great difficulty with expression. But when you see him in social situations, he is able to supplement his limited speech with other modalities like gesturing or alphabet searching, drawing, or even writing out the words that he's stuck on. On the other hand, we have patient B, and she's a 67-year-old female. She lives alone by herself. She's not working right now and is retired. She has been diagnosed with moderate Broca's aphasia and has difficulty with her expressive skills, similar to patient A. But when you see her communicating with others, she often gets stuck during communication situations. She perseverates a lot. She's also not very good in successfully using other alternative strategies to get through that communication breakdown. And as a result, demonstrates a lot of frustration and anger towards her communication incapabilities. So here we have two patients have similar aphasia profiles, but when you see them in a more naturalistic social communication context, their social competences are actually different. And so you would wonder, you know, how is that the case? It's not just language, right? And I'm sure all of us have come across such patients where they may have more severe aphasia, but in terms of communication, they are maybe more successful than others. So keeping these two case examples in mind, we need to think about what communication is, and the fact that successful communication does not only rely on an intact language system, but it also relies on a wide range of other skills to make it a successful event. So extralinguistic skills, basically, these are skills that go beyond language, and this includes attention, memory, executive functioning. These skills can contribute to communication outcomes. So I like to think of cognition as this missing piece of the puzzle that could explain these variances that we're seeing in people with aphasia in terms of their communication competence. When you think about it, when we're using language in a more naturalistic communication context, that can be quite cognitively demanding, right? So imagine that you're at a restaurant talking with a friend, and you're telling them about this recent vacation that you've taken. So it entails a number of different processes. First, you would have to activate the information from your allocated knowledge stores. You would then have to generate some main ideas to talk about. Then you would have to sequence and organize these thoughts in a coherent manner and produce it in an organized manner so that the listener or your friend is able to understand what you're talking about and follow the conversation. So understandably, language is closely interlinked to these other cognitive skills, which makes communication successful. So let's begin with some definitions here. I want to start with what cognition is. So cognition are a set of higher level mental functions. And I like this definition by Bales in 2001. And they define cognition as those skills that allow us to know what we know. And these are the processes that enable us to acquire and manipulate information. So cognition is a broad term, and it is comprised of different skills. And so typically when we think about cognition, we're thinking about skills including attention, language, processing speed, executive functioning, praxis, emotional processing, visual-spatial skills, as well as memory. So in my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on two aspects of cognition, which is language and executive functioning. I want to make a note here that language is considered a part of cognition and is interrelated to other cognitive skills. And many research studies have already established this. So this is, again, a kind of important to reiterate because in many, the viewpoints differ on this, and many individuals, many researchers and clinicians think that language is somehow separate from cognition, but in fact, it's a part of cognition. So understandably, there will be some relationship with other cognitive skills as well. So moving on to specifically about executive functioning, these are the higher level interconnected cognitive functions that we use in our everyday life to complete novel, complex, goal-directed tasks. So it's quite a multidimensional construct, and it involves several sub-processes such as working memory, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, problem solving, reasoning, planning, organization, and self-awareness. So these skills play a supervisory role and coordinate with the more basic cognitive functions such as attention and memory. Talking at the neurological level, executive functioning skills are mediated by the frontal lobe as well as its connections with the posterior part in the cortex, as well as subcortical regions such as the basal ganglia, the hypothalamus, which makes up the limbic system, which is also implicated in executive functioning, and the midbrain. So the neural networks that are responsible and are activated for executive functioning are also partially supporting language. So it makes sense that when there is a damage to any of these overlapping areas, not only will you see problems with language, it is more likely that these individuals will also show concomitant executive functioning deficits. So to give you an example, you might see overlap in activations when an individual is performing, let's say, the word retrieval or the naming subtest of the Western Aphasia battery. The same regions may also be activated when they're performing a backward digit span task, which looks at working memory. So it's extremely important to understand that there's this critical link between executive functioning and language abilities. When you think about the different etiologies and where you see cognitive linguistic impairments, cognitive impairments are commonly documented across a number of different neurological etiologies. So for instance, in stroke, over 50% of individuals are reported to have cognitive deficits. And we know that approximately 1/3 of people who have sustained a stroke present with aphasia. The percentage is a little higher for TBI, but approximately 70% of TBI patients present with cognitive impairment, and around 15 to 20% have language impairments. I must say this is an underreported number because even mild TBI can be underdiagnosed. In neurodegenerative conditions, we know that it begins typically with declines in memory, but then eventually the language functions start to get affected as well. And so in populations such as Alzheimer's disease, a large proportion of the patients do show cognitive linguistic impairment. So back to executive functioning in aphasia. Several studies have documented thus far that executive functioning impairments can frequently co-occur in aphasia, and they have been associated with specific language deficits such as difficulties in auditory word comprehension, auditory sentence recognition, word retrieval. They've also been associated with functional communication impairment and rehabilitation effectiveness. So in short, people who perform more poorly on executive functioning tasks have shown poor functional communicative success and also poor rehabilitation prognosis. So why is it important to address executive functioning in aphasia? Because these difficulties that we see in executive functioning and language can have a combined effect on a person's quality of life. More specifically, these cognitive linguistic skills or deficits can hinder social communication and vocational or employment outcomes. They can be a major barrier in terms of community reintegration. The person may then experience increased dependence on others, even for routine tasks. And overall, this may negatively impact independent living outcomes and quality of life of people with aphasia. But everything that we know about this link between executive functioning and life participation actually comes from the TBI research literature. In contrast, this relationship has not been explored very well in people with aphasia. So there are a number of research and clinical issues that exist. Number one is the lack of consensus amongst researchers and clinicians regarding executive functioning. So first of all, what is executive functioning? The definition varies widely. If you read articles or textbooks, what sub-processes are considered executive functioning skills? When it comes to assessment of executive functioning in aphasia, so far, restricted measures have been used or composite measures have been used to get a good idea of what the extent of deficits might be. So an example would be just using the Raven's colored progressive matrices subtest of the Western aphasia battery to look at cognition or executive functioning. Similarly, many of the cognitive screeners give us a composite score. And so that one score might not tell us what is the extent and breadth of executive functioning deficits that we're seeing in this population. And the other issue that's still a matter of debate is whether executive functioning problems in aphasia are domain specific or domain general. And by that, I mean the deficits that we're seeing in executive functioning in aphasia, are they happening because of the language problems in this population, or are you seeing them across the board regardless of their aphasia? And so to address some of these issues, we did a study, and this is a part of my dissertation project. And the aim was to comprehensively evaluate the extent of executive functioning deficits in persons with varying types and severities of aphasia. So as you can see in the table on the right, we included 22 individuals with aphasia. All of them were in the chronic stages, and 24 healthy controls. And all of these participants completed a comprehensive executive functioning testing battery. So let me move on to the next slide to explain more. I know this is a busy slide, but in this table on the left-hand side, it will tell you the tasks that we did. And on the right side of the table, it tells you which aspect of executive functioning did we look at. And so a lot of thought went into creating this battery. Number one is that most of the subtests most of the tasks, that you see have been used previously with people with aphasia. There are a couple of new ones like the NIH Toolbox, but most of them have already been used in people with aphasia. We also wanted to make sure that we're using more than one task to tap into one specific aspect of executive functioning. So for instance, on the right-hand side, you'll see that more than one tasks are looking at cognitive flexibility. We have more than one task looking at initiation and planning, for instance. The other important consideration here was to include both verbal and non-verbal tasks. So what do I mean by that? Verbal executive functioning tasks are those that require some degree of language processing to complete the task. Non-verbal executive functioning tasks are those that require minimal to no language processing to complete the task. So the ones that are highlighted in red are the non-verbal tasks, and the ones that are highlighted in black are the verbal executive functioning tasks. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of the findings. Let me first orient you to what you're looking at. We did both group level analysis and individual level analysis. And in the graphs that you're seeing here, the gray plots are depicting the aphasia group, and the orange plots are depicting the control group. As you just browse through each of these graphs, you'll see that compared to the healthy controls, the people with aphasia demonstrated lower scores on most of these executive functioning tasks that we use. And these ones are showing some of the reaction time data. And again, we found that people with aphasia were slower than the healthy controls on some of these executive functioning tasks. And And as you can see on the right side in the graph, people with aphasia were affected on both verbal and non-verbal executive functioning tasks. So if you look on the right, the black bar depicts the aphasia group and the gray bar depicts the control group. And so what we did is for each person, we collated all the verbal executive functioning scores and created a composite Z-score. And then we did the same, taking all the non-verbal tasks and creating a composite Z-score for that. And so a Z-score of 0 would mean that somebody performed at average. So if you just focus on the black bars, you will notice that people with aphasia had greater difficulty with the verbal executive functioning measures. And this is expected because this requires more language processing. But what I want to direct your attention to is on the right side of the graph, where you're also seeing poorer performances on the non-verbal executive functioning tasks. So it's not just that they're doing poorly on the verbal ones, but also on the non-verbal ones. And so our findings were more consistent with the contention that people with aphasia are demonstrating a more domain general deficit, and it's not very specific to their language difficulties. The other important finding was that we did not find any consistent relationship between executive functioning task performance and aphasia severity and age. So it wasn't necessarily the case that people who had more severe aphasia were also performing more poorly on the executive functioning task. The third important finding is that not all people with aphasia demonstrated executive functioning impairment. So that's very important to keep in mind. And we should not be making general conclusions about, yes, people with aphasia have these difficulties. It was only a proportion of our group that showed executive functioning problems. We also saw a considerable amount of variability in the performances of people with aphasia, and these were not necessarily related to their aphasia characteristics. We also saw disproportionate amounts of difficulty across tasks. So it wasn't the case that they were only doing poorly on the verbal tasks. So now moving on to the other issues that are still persisting. One is that how exactly does executive functioning interact with language at the discourse level? That is not very well understood when it comes to people with aphasia. Secondly, the influence of such cognitive linguistic difficulties on life participation and psychosocial outcomes of people with aphasia has not been studied and needs further attention. So as you would have noted, I used the term discourse, and before I move forward, I wanted to establish the definition for it. So discourse refers to the use of spoken or written language in a social communication context. It refers to the expression of ideas, feelings, and opinions. And we can define discourse as language that goes beyond the boundaries of isolated words and sentences. And when you think of it, it's the most fundamental component of everyday communication. So as a part of my dissertation research, we had other research aims as well. And so here we wanted to examine the relationship between executive functioning, spoken discourse, and life participation outcomes of people with aphasia. So this data was also collected from the 22 individuals with aphasia and 24 healthy controls that I talked about earlier. So all of these participants were actually asked to complete a story retell spoken discourse task. And in our study, we used the bear and the fly. I'm not sure if anybody's aware with this story. It's a novel story. We did not want to use a story like the Cinderella, which people already know of, because we were tapping into executive functioning. So this is a really funny story, but we gave them this book. It is a wordless picture book. They took a look at it. Once they were done, we took the book back and they had to narrate the story in their own words. In addition to this, we also had people with aphasia and their care partners complete a few psychosocial and life participation measures. People with aphasia completed the assessment of living with aphasia, which looks at aphasia-related quality of life and is one of my favorite assessments because it's very aphasia friendly and it asks questions that nobody asks people with aphasia. Things like, do you get out to where you want to go? Do you join in simple conversations or complex conversations? And from my experience, my patients really enjoy completing this assessment. The care partners, which was about 14 of them, accompanied people with aphasia. We had the care partners complete the Sydney Psychosocial Reintegration Scale, and this looks at psychosocial functioning after brain injury. So it asks the care partners to fill out and rate the abilities of the person with aphasia. And so there would be questions like, how do you rate the person with aphasia's social skills and behavior in public? How do you rate their personal habits and so on? So for the discourse analysis, we did a pretty comprehensive assessment. Just to give you a little bit of background, we collected the discourse samples, we transcribed them, and then coded them based on structural aspects of discourse. I hope you can see my cursor. We looked at the structural level, so lexical abilities, syntactic, morphological aspects, word retrieval, word classes, and so on. And then we also looked at a more global level, or the functional aspect of discourse, which is also known as the macro structure of discourse. So here we were looking at the organization, the coherence of discourse, and also how meaningful was the output, how many main concepts did they produce about the story. And so that's really an overlap between the structural and functional level. So we did quite a comprehensive analysis. We did not look at the conversational outcomes because that was not the scope of the study. So the key findings were that people with aphasia, as expected, demonstrated problems in both the structural level of discourse as well as the functional level of discourse. When we ran correlations and regression analyses, we found that the executive functioning scores were actually more closely related to the functional aspect of discourse, or the macro-linguistic narrative performance. So how organized was their output? How many main concepts did they produce? Particularly, we found that the tasks that tapped into initiation, planning, sequencing, cognitive flexibility were correlating significantly with discourse coherence, discourse organization, and the production of main concepts. So just to give you an example here on the left-hand side in the graph, this is showing that a person who did well on a semantic fluency task was also producing more accurate and coherent concepts during the discourse. Similarly, on the right-hand side, somebody who switched between different categories during the categorical fluency subtest was producing less coherent errors, so producing fewer errors during their discourse. So overall, what we found was that people with aphasia, some people with aphasia, had difficulty in efficiently applying strategies such as switching between communication modalities. So just to give you an example, I had one individual who uses his communication notebook. He had that on the table actually. And when he was describing the discourse, they were allowed to use different modalities. But this individual just failed to remember to even use his communication book and was struggling to verbally produce his utterances. They also sometimes had difficulties generating the main ideas to convey the story in a coherent and organized manner. And some of the people also failed to monitor their output and correct themselves when needed. Overall, our study findings are consistent with the few number of studies that have previously explored this relationship between executive functioning and functional communication success, which was promising. Now I'm going to talk about the relationship between executive functioning and life participation outcomes. What we found was that low life participation and psychosocial well-being scores were associated with difficulties in planning, cognitive flexibility, and self-monitoring. We also looked at a number of demographic variables and injury variables, and we found that age and aphasia severity were positively associated with several psychosocial assessment scores. So at a group level, what we were finding is that greater the age, the person's life participation was better. The higher the WOB scores, meaning less severe aphasia, their psychosocial outcomes were better. But when we dug deeper and looked at the individual level analysis, this was only true for 1/3 of the patients. So for the rest of the 2/3, it wasn't consistent. That relationship wasn't consistent. So again, to give you specific examples, I had a couple of younger participants who sustained a stroke, and they had mild aphasia, but they reported poorer scores on their life participation outcomes. Similarly, I had one individual who was 15 years into his aphasia recovery, and he reported to have better psychosocial outcomes just because he had that time to undergo therapy. He had a very good family support, friend circle, and so his life living with aphasia was better than the younger individuals. We also found that narrative performance was significantly associated with life participation and functional outcomes. In fact, we found that the discourse measures, the discourse scores, were more sensitive and better predictors of quality of life than the WOB aphasia quotient. And so there are some clinical implications that I want to talk about here. First, it is challenging to predict one's cognitive profile just based on traditional language assessments. And if you are, if you're looking to assess cognition or executive functioning more specifically, relying on one single assessment may not be sufficient because that gives us an incomplete picture of the extent of deficits that the person may be demonstrating. There's also a high amount of variability that we see in people with aphasia in terms of their executive functioning abilities. So every person might be different. Also, no obvious deficit in the frontal lobe has to be there to show executive functioning impairment. So just because the person with aphasia doesn't have a frank frontal lobe damage doesn't mean that you don't assess for executive functioning. Just because if you think back to the slide where I talked about the neural correlates, it's a network of structures that are participating in executive functioning. And routine executive functioning assessment must be carried out irrespective of the aphasia characteristics. Our study showed that, and even some previous studies have shown that aphasia severity is not a reliable indicator of one's executive functioning profile. So now I'm going to talk about how can we address executive functioning in people with aphasia. I'm going to begin with some general cognitive screeners. This is for acquired brain injury in general. All of us are aware of the Montreal cognitive assessment, and it's used very widely worldwide. I like it because it has better sensitivity and specificity compared to the mini mental state exam. I really like their website. I've put it over here. The only recent change is that now you would need to be certified and show certification to be able to administer the MOCA. I like the MOCA because it's available in multiple languages beyond English. The other one is the Cognistat, which again is a good screener to look at different cognitive aspects. It has a strong psychometric validation for it. And the nice thing about it is it's available in English, yes, but it's also available in Hindi and Arabic. A very popular assessment for people with aphasia has been the Cognitive Linguistic Quick Test. This is a very good assessment, especially in clinical settings if you want to assess attention, memory, executive functioning, language, and visual spatial perception. So it gives you a total composite severity rating. And also you separately, if you want to do an even more quick, if you don't have too much time, you can only use the clock drawing subtest, and it has a very good and detailed scoring just for that subtest, and you can get an idea of what their cognition profile looks like briefly. So this is from the manual of the CLQT. I really like this table because it shows you on the left the tasks that are included in the CLQT and what domains of cognition are being looked at. And then you see here that a number of different subtests do look at executive functioning. So the CLQT Plus is actually a more recently published version, and this is a version keeping people with aphasia in mind. So on the left-hand side is the traditional administration of the traditional CLQT. On the right, you're seeing the CLQT Plus specific administration. So most of the subtests remain the same. There's one additional subtest, and you'll see there's an asterisk next to some of the subtests, which is basically showing that there's a difference in scoring that we would have to consider when we're working with people with aphasia. So the nice thing about the CLQT Plus is that you can get a non-linguistic cognition index, a linguistic cognition index, or the aphasia index, and then again, you can separately use the clock drawing as well. So this is very widely used when it comes to people with aphasia. Just some examples here. Here we have the symbol cancellation task on the left, where the patient is asked to cancel out a given symbol without scanning left to right. And then on the right side is just an example of the clock drawing subtest, where you're having them put all the numbers in and having them set the hands to 10 minutes past 11. Another good test is the comprehensive test of nonverbal intelligence, or the CTONI. This is, again, it is in the name, it's a nonverbal good test for people with aphasia, and it evaluates problem solving and complex reasoning. On the left here, you're seeing this is an example of a pictorial analogy subtest, where you would have to pick one of the 5 options below which matches best with this missing box here. And so there would be some level of semantic processing for this, but it's minimal. And then on the right is an example of the geometric category subtest of the CTONI. Another good example of a test that can be used for people with aphasia and has been used for people with aphasia is the trail making test. You don't have to have access to the full test. It's actually included very commonly as a part of other cognitive batteries, like the CLQT has one subtest on this. The test of verbal conceptualization and fluency has a subtest on this. So basically what you would have the patient do is connect the dots by alternating between the number and letter. So you would go from 1A and then 2B, 3C, and so on. More recently, there's the color trails test, a different version of the trail making test, where you are still doing the same thing, but alternating between the numbers and the colors. I think most of us are aware of the Ravens-colored progressive matrices, which is included in the Western aphasia battery. It looks at visual problem solving, and the patient must select one of these 6 patterns or 6 options that would complete the visual pattern on top. So this is, again, a good nonverbal option. A newer test is the National Institute of Health Toolbox, or the NIH Toolbox. I have used certain subtests. It's quite a comprehensive battery, actually. You would have to pay a yearly subscription for it. But specifically, I really like the dimensional change card sort task, which is similar to the Wisconsin card sort, and also the flanker inhibitory control and attention test, which is again similar to the traditional flanker task. The nice thing about NIH Toolbox is that you don't have to do any manual scoring. It's done, and you can get an Excel sheet with the reports at the end. It also looks at accuracy and reaction time, so you'll get scores for both of those. And then moving on to a widely used assessment in brain injury in general are the verbal fluency tasks. We can also do the same with people with aphasia, and I've done that in my study, and I've used it clinically as well. So you can do a semantic fluency task where you're having them name items within categories. So name as many animals you can think of in 1 minute, and the WOB has a subtest on this as well. You can also do letter naming, or the phonemic fluency, where you're having them name words or tell words starting with a certain letter. A nonverbal counterpart for the verbal fluency would be the Ruff-Figueroa fluency test. This measures nonverbal design fluency or divergent thinking, and it assesses cognitive flexibility, inhibition, planning, and strategy use. As you can see, there are actually 5 pages in the RFFT, and the patient is asked to come up with as many unique designs as they can in 1 minute. And so as you can see, as they complete the task, and as they move through the pages, it gets a little bit more complex. So this on the left-hand side is a little easier compared to the page 3, which has more distractions. So somebody who has inhibition difficulties may have a harder time completing this task. I also want to highlight a little bit about the scoring for these verbal fluency.
Dr. Mansida, can I just take a?
Yeah.
It will be nice if you could leave some time for question answers and discussions also.
Sure.
So we were planning 45 plus 15, but it's fine. So
yeah,
if you could wind up, then
Thank you,
I'm
Dr.
sure there are
Narayan.
lots of questions from audience.
Thank you, Dr. Narayan. Yeah, I will wrap it up quickly. Sorry, just to kind of talk about the scoring, I want to highlight that we not only need to look at the accuracy, but how the patients perform the task. So not only how many items they got correct, but how did they perform the task. So here's just an example of the qualitative scoring that you can do for the verbal fluency. So this is from my study that we looked at. So we looked at the number of clusters that the patient produced. So when you're naming animals, for instance, you tend to go through smaller categories. So first you would name the domestic animals, then you would switch and move to the wild animals, for instance. So this switching, the number of switches that were made during the task it reflects executive functioning problems. And this has been studied widely in the acquired brain injury literature. You can do the same thing for a design fluency task where you can actually study patterns and strategies that are used to come up with new designs. And I'm happy to talk about this more. Okay, in terms of the indirect measures of executive functioning, as clinicians, we're encouraged to use spoken discourse and functional communication tasks because these are quite cognitively demanding and do reflect breakdowns in executive functioning. And when I say communication, I'm talking about spoken discourse as well as conversational tasks as well. And then finally, patient-reported outcomes are extremely important. This is not captured by standardized aphasia assessments. And like I said, my patients really enjoyed it, and they're really good to identify barriers and evaluate activity and participation related outcomes in people with aphasia. This slide is just to share with you some tools for discourse analysis that can be used clinically. I've mentioned the most common tools that are used, but on the right-hand side, I wanted to share this excellent resource called Aphasia Bank. Most of you are aware, I'm sure, but this is such a good site. I use this a lot for my teaching. There are nice videos, video examples of people with aphasia, and down below, you have this discourse analysis tab. If you click on it, it will tell you all the procedures of how to do each type of analysis and what kind of outcome measures you should be expecting. And just last couple of minutes talking about addressing executive functioning in treatment. Why is it important? Now that we know that, yes, if we do the assessment, we know, okay, this person with aphasia is demonstrating executive functioning problems. It's important because executive functioning may help us identify who are better communicators versus poor communicators. Understanding their cognitive abilities will assist us in determining which patients are better candidates for certain types of intervention, and we can also identify what are the best treatment options for people with aphasia. So you can identify those who, let's say, have a poor executive functioning profile. In that case, I would target the underlying problematic executive functioning skill, like targeting working memory in therapy. Relatively, in contrast, people who have a relatively preserved executive functioning profile, you can spend time in therapy training the use of metacognitive and communication strategies so that they can rely on other alternative modalities to be more successful in their communication. So these are just some examples of studies that have addressed executive functioning in aphasia treatment, and both of these studies are highly, highly recommended in terms of reading and just to see how it has been incorporated in treatment. And to conclude, I think as a field, we really need to start moving beyond looking at discrete language assessment and looking at other factors that could contribute to communication so that we can provide a more holistic care to our patients. Performance on standardized aphasia tests, it has been well established by now that it does not fully reflect a person's conversational competence in natural communication situations. Aphasia severity is not a reliable predictor of their rehabilitation outcomes and life participation outcomes. So in general, if we are able to adopt a cognitive linguistic approach that's targeting both language as well as extra-linguistic cognitive skills in treatment and assessment, I think we can definitely yield better quality of life outcomes and make a difference in people with aphasia and their lives. These are my references. Thank you all for your attention, and I will take any questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Manasudha, for that wonderful exposition of a very, it's an intriguing area, and you have now introduced us to the problems of executive dysfunction, which lies hidden in aphasia. It's very, very difficult to, in fact, elicit it. But you have shown us some of the tools which can be used to elicit it, and once this adds on to the already significant problem of aphasic deficits that a person is having, that significantly increases or even multiplies the actual disability that a patient could be having. The paper is open to discussions. How much time do we have, Sonal? Do we strictly have to close at 7? Then it leaves us only 2-3 minutes only. But if you could
extend to 10-15 minutes, sir. It's up to the Manaswita if she's able to spend.
Yeah, I'm able to
minutes.
stay. No problem. I'm happy.
And I hope IAN Digital will keep it open till then. Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
We don't see any question yet from the audience.
Yeah, we haven't got any typed question, but I'm sure that there will be question. I will start the ball rolling. Is that okay, Dr. Anama? Can I ask a couple of questions?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
So one of the major issues I'm seeing is in someone with an aphasia to also look for the presence of executive dysfunction as well as the degree of executive dysfunction.
Right.
Is that many of the tests that we do for executive dysfunction assessment needs the patient to first of all comprehend the command. So in aphasias where there is a significant defect of comprehension, for example, posterior aphasias and Wernicke's aphasias, when the comprehension itself is significantly affected and they don't understand what we are talking to them. And this is not only the spoken commands, but also the written commands. Both are affected in Wernicke's aphasia. So how do you go about eliciting any of these deficits at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Naran. Thank you for asking. So it is not easy, but that's why I think I picked the assessments that have been widely used in people with aphasia because they have been administered. I do want to focus on the fact that we did have to do some adaptations. Number one was we presented the instructions to them, not only in the spoken modality, but it was also written out for them in bigger fonts. So they were able to understand the numbers. The second modification that we did some practice items for each of the tasks. So once it was established that they understand what they are supposed to do, then we proceeded with the experimental stimuli. And so most of these assessments, even clinically, do have practice items. So I highly recommend doing that just to make sure that their understanding is adequate. And yes, you're right, Dr. Narayan, there will be a couple of participants who just will have a difficult time understanding. For those individuals, it will be difficult to administer, but I would want to say most of the individuals that I've worked with, after doing these adaptations, they were able to consistently perform the task. The other thing about expression. You mentioned about comprehension and expression. We did allow multiple modalities for expression. So for instance, we used something called the test of everyday attention, and they had to tell me the number of times they heard high tones, for instance. And so instead of saying it verbally, if they were not able to do it, we also had a number line in front of them. So they had to point to the number that they think is the right answer. And so those kinds of adaptations were done to make sure they were able to follow the task and actually complete the task.
Can we say that it's only those people who have at least say a comprehension level 2 or at least level only then we can execute these tests, or is it only in case of those with the significant anterior aphasias, Broca's, and the transcortical motor aphasias? It is these type of aphasias that we can actually do a proper executive function assessment, or it just randomly it could be A or B or C. I mean, I would imagine it's the formal thing. You need to have people predominantly in the anterior aphasias. You can do that because the comprehension is relatively intact. And also, even in those there is some degree of comprehension deficit. At least if you have say level 1 or level 2 comprehension, then only we can do. And level 3, 2 or 3, and those who are comprehension is very poor, it's only just level 1 and all. Maybe there might be limitations in eliciting it. Is that a fair conclusion? Is that a fair conclusion, or you are telling?
Sonal wants to add something.
Yeah.
Also, executive functions for everyday settings also are important. So we might have some non-verbal everyday actions which can be used similar to the camel and cactus or pyramids and palm tree. We have developed some sets of the Indianized tests that will be there for the public domain. So it would be helpful to understand, like Wisconsin card sorting wise, or Power Tower of Hanoi, or a camel and cactus, and PPT type tasks which need not have much of the verbal domain, but typical attention, visual, spatial, and executive function. Yes, the neglect and all has to be taken care of there. So that could be helpful actually when you have to go with the executive function. It's a very valid point you have raised, Manaswita and Professor Narayan. Anama ma'am would like to add something on EF in her subcortical and cortical aphasic profiles. She has really developed
I just want to add in the sense, I was also trying to convey the same thing in the sense I wanted to say that sometimes with some of them the non-verbal tests have to be used. Yeah, it's like we have the non-verbal option. But in like Sir said, if the severity of aphasia is so much, then we may not be able to administer any of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to also mention that there can be adaptations. I would refrain from not doing such tests because I can share citations with you where executive functioning actually has been done with people with severe aphasia. Olsen and colleagues actually did that. They actually did the CLQT with them. So I would highly recommend trying it. And I'm a big proponent of looking at, for sure, non-verbal, because sometimes it's easier, but I do think we should also look at verbal, because like I said, discourse actually would be a good way to tap into executive functioning. You don't have to do a separate task, because that's what our goal is as speech therapists, is to make them communicate better. And so that's something that I'm really passionate about and want to do more research in, where I think people who have executive functioning deficits are struggling more. They're not the ones who are using more gestures. But if there are people who have severe aphasia, but they're able to point and relay to us what they want to say, I understand what they're saying. And so I think executive functioning do have to play a huge role in that. And to Dr. Narayan's point, I really appreciate you bringing up that I would say I would look at the auditory comprehension level and I would try it. If it doesn't work, unfortunately, that's fine. But I would try at least to do one or two. And rather than, again, I have seen a lot of variability, which is why I don't go strictly by the classification of anterior versus posterior, because I've seen a lot of variation in comprehension and expression. So that dichotomous classification sometimes doesn't hold true for my patients. So I think the verbal fluency, the design fluency, they take what, 5 minutes, right? And so it doesn't take very long, but we can get an amount of good information just from doing that. So I would say I would try it and then try to get as much as we can.
Sonal, I think we have questions in the chat box. Can you just look at them?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
one.
So do you want to start with those questions, Dr. Anama?
Let me just see. Yeah, the first question is, now that we have muddied the waters by mixing aphasia with executive function, we have a problem of definition and traditional teaching models that neurologists are used to. What are the solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. So what I'm trying to do in terms of teaching, I actually have a whole section on cognition in aphasia. I was not trained like that. I was mainly, when I was in aphasia classes myself, it was the main focus was on language. So I do introduce language models. And then I spend a whole one day, which is a 3-hour lecture on cognition models and cognition and how that what are the implications of that in people with aphasia. There are very good seminal papers that have been published that I share with my students, and they tell me even now where clinicians that they're working with don't tend to look at executive functioning, and they tell me, Dr. Datta, why aren't they looking at executive functioning? Because they have been trained like that. And so there are many models that do inform people executive functioning in people with aphasia, like Badley and Hitch's model is used very frequently. Miyake's model is used very frequently. So I bring those up in my teaching and then do kind of, it is muddy. That's what I talked about initially, is that this whole concept of executive functioning is still muddy, but I try to kind of clear it out as much as possible for the students so they know that it is important to address and not neglected in people with aphasia.
So if you could just put your email in the chat box, and if anybody wants specific references to things that you spoke about or papers you're referring to, I think they can get you for that. I'll just move on because we're short of time.
Sure.
The second is, any Indian tests to assess executive fluency? I don't know, Manaswita, if you can.
Yeah, so thank you. I actually was curious myself, and I was doing a lot of research, and looks like verbal fluency, especially semantic fluency, is used very widely. And you can also do, all the traditional aphasia tests, like the Western Aphasia Battery does come with a cognitive section. So I would highly recommend doing any of those. You can also do the clock drawing test, which is easy to do, especially for higher literate people. It's very easy to do, and you can use the scoring for that to look at what their executive functioning looks like. And as I said, even verbal fluency, design fluency, you can look beyond just accuracy and see how qualitatively are they performing the task.
I would also chip in with a small point, if you don't mind. Recently, the Indian Council of Medical Research, along with the Suvarna's team in NIMANS, the cognitive neurology team, they have actually developed a cognitive battery for India specific and translated into various Indian languages as a DST ICMR project. Actually.
Okay, that's great. I'll have to look into that.
Sunil sir, can we move on to other questions, or you want them to be okay?
No. I think the next question is probably same point. I think Dr. Partha is continuation of his first question. is the same thing here. Like he has written, it's a long question.
You have taken only 2 features of executive function as language and communication. As you showed, there are 9 other domains. How will you standardize research methodology from now onwards? The field of research will get further complex if we add fMRI and DTI to all the connectomes. We are then into deeper waters. That makes us cognitively human.
Right. Okay, so that's more of a
probably just continuing with whatever was being said.
Yeah, and I agree. It is difficult. It's not clear cut, and so that's why I think that's probably one of the reasons why it was delayed. We're in 2022, and now is when the research is really emerging related to executive functioning and aphasia. And but I do think there's a lot of value in it, and I think all of us can make certain contributions to help answer these questions and come up with sensitive measures that can be used for people with aphasia. And the examples that I showed in my slides are being used with people with aphasia. So at least we have a starting point at this time.
Okay, there's one more question which says, do premorbid language proficiencies of a person with aphasia impact executive function?
That's a great question. There is some emerging research on this where it does affect, I believe, Gilmore and colleagues in 2019 looked at this, but this definitely needs to be looked into. I would say there would be a connection.
Okay,
So,
and sir,
yeah.
one last thing that I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
You had in your study, which you presented here, in terms of you said the type and severity of aphasia, there was no change in the results that you got. I would like to know, like, how many, when did you do the test? Like post-stroke, how many months did you?
Oh, I see. Yeah, so all of them were chronic stages, but the chronicity actually varied significantly. So we had individuals who were 8 months post-stroke all the way to 15 to 16, actually 20 years stroke. So we wanted to include a wide variety.
Okay, so none of them were immediate post.
No. That's again, I think, another avenue to even explore how it would, what kind of presentation would you see in acute aphasia?
Yes, sir. So, anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring that there's an interesting condition. It's a tau degenerative disease of a type of frontotemporal dementia, where which is called primary progressive aphasia.
Correct.
This is a classical condition where it's a tauopathy, and here there is the presentation and the predominant domain affected is executive dysfunction.
Yes.
But then they go on to develop very severe, profound aphasia, progressive to the extent of sometimes becoming totally mute as well.
Right.
So, and the other situation in neurology practice, small vessel diseases, where we get again executive dysfunction, frontal executive dysfunction, and they may get subcortical types of aphasias, but many a time the more of the pseudobulbar type of dysarthria. So, in many of the situations, to this splitting these executive dysfunction in an aphasia patient is quite challenging. So, it's very nice to listen to some of these important tests that you introduced today, which, as I understand from you, could be delivered even in people with aphasia, and hopefully in those with Wernicke's aphasia as well. So that's quite interesting. Now I'll end with asking a very simple question. What's the kind of in an outpatient clinic when you are sitting and we have a patient with a post-stroke aphasia or following some other lesion they developed in aphasia. If you want to qualitatively decide what is the type of aphasia and quantitatively ascertain what is the degree of aphasia, severity of aphasia, so that we know what is the effects of intervention, etc. later on. What basic tests do you follow in your institution? And it's a very basic question, not
right. I would do a testing battery rather than just doing the WOB. So WOB is, the gold standard that's followed. I personally am a fan of comprehensive aphasia test because it's psychometrically much stronger. So if you said a post-stroke aphasia patient walks into my clinic, I would do that. I would do one of the aphasia assessments because we want to quantify the severity and extent of aphasia. So that's one. In addition, I would do some sort of cognitive assessment, whether it's the CLQT or the cognitive battery within the comprehensive aphasia test or Western aphasia battery. I would do that. And I love to collect a naturalistic language sample. So it just takes, a couple of minutes, but then I get to record. I did that actually recently with a patient last week. I said, okay, can you tell me about a recent or an important life event that was important to you? And they give you that, we record that, and later on go back and analyze the discourse sample. So that's, given the realistic amounts of time that we have in the clinic, I would split it into 2 sessions, but this is what I would do. And then if the other thing I do is if we don't have time, I send quality of life questionnaires to the family via email. They fill it out and bring it back the next session.
And these more or less the standard practice in the
that would I would say it's standardized practice in hospitals. It's still just the WOB, and that's it. And so I think I have the liberty to work in outpatient clinic, and I have the liberty to do what I want to do, but it's still not common practice even here in the US.
The NIH toolkit is also useful in this scenario, I think.
Yeah,
I saw you mentioning that as well, actually.
Exactly. Yeah.
And last question for me. This is really the last question. When somebody with a mixed problem of aphasia and executive dysfunction starts recovering, do you think do they recover pari passu, or the recovery from one is more it's important for the recovery of the other? Do they follow any sequence, or do they recover pari together?
That's a great question. I don't think many studies have looked at. I would love to do a longitudinal study to follow patients and see, but I'm thinking at the neurological level, if those areas are recovering, then I would see parallel recovery to some extent in both of these cognitive domains. But it would, individual differences is such a big issue in aphasia. And so I would be curious to see what that pattern looks like for a larger sample.
Right. I think we have covered all the questions, but the audience, if there are any other burning one question or something.
There's a nice comment, sir, which says, great exposition, Professor Datta. Really liked your talk and the foresight you gave in the aphasia field.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I
Dr.
really
Partha.
appreciate it.
Partha is quite active in academic discussions.
That's amazing.
So, Sonal, do you want to? So, as Dr. Partha has said, very thought-provoking talk. You have introduced into this real muddy waters, but challenging area.
Yeah.
And you have exposed us to a number of important tests which will be useful. And it will be great if you could, since we have not taken notes or something, you could, if you could share through Sonal some of the tests. Are they all licensed? Do you have to pay to use them, or are
some of them are?
Some of them are available free as well?
Some of them are actually, they have to be paid, like the CLQT has to be purchased, but the verbal fluency, really, you don't need a test for that. And you can do it. Discourse, you don't need a test for that. But like, that's why I said the Aphasia Bank is an excellent resource for people who are interested. I'm happy to send my slides. And I'm also aware, as I was doing my research, the CLQT, I believe, has been adapted in
CLQT, I heard you talk.
It's available in Canada.
Yeah, right. And so I think that is one avenue that we really need to start looking at, is adapting and standardizing in different languages, because that is one area that, personally I'm trying to address, and other
I think, Sonal, that's a good idea. We could all, we could all work together and trying to adapt it to the Indian condition with the help and support involving Dr. Manaswita also.
It takes a long time, but I'm really interested in doing that because
it will take time, but
we
I
need
think
it.
we can start working on take it up as a project. I'm sure that IAN will be happy to support that, and we will work on this. You please, so it will be great if those Sonal, if you could some of the slides and could share with us and those who ask for it, and then continue to work on this developing as a project. I think IAN has some funding also, so we can ask Malsuria to help us with some funds also towards that. Yeah. So thank you. I think we should be winding up.
I just wanted to thank all of you for this enriching discussion and at least being receptive to the idea of testing executive functioning. And I'm happy to be part of more discussions because I do think there's a real need in the field of aphasia for this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. So thank you, and please do help us with continuing this communication and the collaboration. So I will leave it to Sonal to do the final pointing.
Anama ma'am, any concluding remarks from your side too?
Yes, just a very short thing. I'm very happy that this topic was taken up today, so that a lot of people are able to think a little out of the box.
Right, exactly.
Okay, one. Second thing, second thing is that also I'd like to add that who benefits at the end of this? It's 100%. The patient. It's the patient who benefits finally from that. Right. So it just has got everybody else thinking that what else should we look for to make the patient more better, and also to help each. While testing, look out for those things, make the correct interpretations, but even when you test. So with that, I think it's going to be a more fruitful relationship that the patient is going to have with us if we look at it in a bigger, broader picture. So thank you for opening and bringing out this topic once more, Manaswita, and best wishes for your future research.
Thank you, Dr. George. It is a pleasure. A pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this evening. Thank you very much.
Me too. Thank you.
So much, Dr. Sunil Narayan and Ms. Anama George, ma'am. It was really great, insightful panel. Dr. Manaswita, you made a wonderful resource person. I'm sure the Indian researchers, SLPs, neurologists, neurosurgeons, psychologists listening to you here would surely take home message that how verbal and non-verbal executive functions need to be accumulated in your everyday language and communication assessment, and how incorporating those EF in the everyday therapy could be really helpful in making the difference in the intervention and outcome measurement. So it has been a wonderful panel and a very active, engaging, interactive panel discussion. I thank you all. I thank all the audience for being here and joining us and for your insightful questions. Please stay tuned. We have another webinar lined up for you. May I share the slide? Yes. So on 28th of June, 5 p.m., not 6, we have Professor Copeland going to be enlightening us on neurobiological principles of post-stroke aphasia recovery. So stay tuned, make sure to join us and have engaging interactive sessions carried ahead. Please support persons with aphasia. Try getting early referrals, identification, and early intervention. Try to learn, grow, and share. That's how I always feel in Indian aphasiology. We have so much to do, so much to contribute. And thanks, Manaswita. You're taking a lovely research. We're proud of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, all of you.
Thank you so much, all.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
sir.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sunil, sir. Thank you, Sonal. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Bye-bye. Thanks, Sunil, sir. Bye.
Bye.